All right, it's Philip Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. This is Monday, the 25th of October. Today I'm going to read you the first chapter, the preface from my book, U.S. Grant's Failed Presidency. What's happened over the last 20 or 30 years, he has become sort of the Teflon man. Like about 30, 35 years ago, Robert E. Lee was disparagingly referred to as the Marble Man, meaning that he was overrated. And so over those ensuing 30, 35 years, Grant's reputation has been improved. And he's now become the Teflon man who can basically do no wrong. I wanted to write an analysis of his presidency because it is an important component of my study of Reconstruction. And also, his presidency wasn't good. It just wasn't good. It's nothing to be proud of. And the hagiographies that have been written about him, the glowing biographies that have been written about him in the last 30 years, really minimize all that, sweep it under the carpet. So I wanted to get the truth out. Let me start by just showing you a copy of the cover of my book, and then I'll just proceed into reading the preface. It won't take too long, so hang on here. I'll bring up the cover of my book. There it is. U.S. Grant's Failed Presidency. You can get a copy of it from Amazon.com for $20. If you want a signed copy by me, you can get it for $23, and I will pay the postage if you're in the United States. The way to contact me is at my email address, Phil_Lee, Leigh, at me.com. So with that, let me stop the sharing and bring up the first chapter of the book, and just give me a second to get to the right page. Okay, almost there. Here we go. This is the preface of the book. Ulysses Grant's presidency deserves a fresh analysis because modern historians and biographers have lifted him too high. Initially, their rehabilitation of his previously mixed reputation concentrated on his military performance during the Civil War, but more lately it has included his presidency. In 1948, for example, Grant ranked near the bottom at 28th out of 30 presidents. But in 2017, a different survey ranked him in the middle of the pack at 22nd out of 41 rated presidents. The rankings improvement reflects two factors. First is an increasing focus on his civil rights policies on behalf of blacks, if not other minorities. Historians who came of age or during or after the 1960 civil rights movement tend to concentrate on the racial aspects of Reconstruction. In a 2008 interview, for example, Ron Chernow proclaimed Grant to be, quote, the single most important president in terms of civil rights between Abraham Lincoln and Lyndon Johnson, close quote. The second factor is a tenacious propensity among modern historians to minimize the corruption that plagued his presidency, as well as an inclination to dismiss suspicions that he may have been personally culpable in a number of the scandals. Regarding the first point, today's historians too often fail to critically evaluate Grant's motives for supporting black civil rights, particularly voting rights. He is commonly portrayed as promoting them in order to make a noble stand for racial equality. They fail to adequately examine evidence that his prime motive may have instead been to gain political power that a routinely obedient voting bloc could provide to Republican candidates. Consider, for example, that only a minority of America's whites voted for Grant when he was first elected president in 1868. Despite his popularity as a war hero, his 300,000 popular vote majority resulted from winning about 90% or more of the votes among the mostly illiterate ex-slaves. About 97% of them were illiterate. More importantly, Grant may have limited his civil rights advocacy to blacks since they composed the solitary minority group that could be politically significant. He did nothing for smaller racial minorities such as Indians, Chinese Americans, and other immigrant groups. In fact, at the end of the Civil War, Grant even opposed voting rights for blacks, including those who were Union veterans. His move toward black suffrage over the next 3 years paralleled his increasing intimacy with radical Republicans and fully crystallized with his nomination for president on the Republican ticket in May 1868. Indians generally could not vote during Grant's administration. Moreover, in 1875-76, he secretly provoked a war with tribes in the northern Great Plains. He wanted to give white men access to doubtfully valuable gold deposits in the Black Hills in order to help America's economy recover from the depression that followed the Panic of 1873. That panic began when the investment banking house of Jay Cooke and Company failed. The morning that the bank failed, General Grant had breakfast with Jay Cooke because he was a guest at Jay Cooke's mansion in Philadelphia. Although the Black Hills War is best known for the fight at Custer's last stand, the Supreme Court ruled a century later that it was illegal and awarded over $100 million in damages to tribal descendants. Chinese Americans were also generally denied the vote. They could not even become naturalized citizens until 1943, when many of them were serving in America's armed forces. Even though they numbered more than 10% of California's population, although they never numbered more than 10% of California's population, they represented about 2/3 of the state's lynch victims between 1849 and 1902. In fact, the biggest lynching in American history took place in Los Angeles during Grant's first presidential term in 1871. The 19 victims were Chinese Americans. Since the 14th Amendment only granted citizenships to blacks born in America, Grant signed the 1870 Naturalization Act in order to enable blacks born elsewhere to become American citizens. But the act deliberately excluded Chinese Americans and other non-whites. In 1875, he signed the Page Act that restricted entry into America by Chinese immigrants and other, quote, undesirables, close quote. The 1875 Civil Rights Act also failed to include Chinese Americans. And in his book, Driven Out, The Forgotten War Against Chinese Americans, Gene Pelzer explained the effect of such restrictions and omissions. Quote, the Civil Rights Act and the Page Act of 1875 removed the right of Chinese immigrants to ever become citizens and banned the immigration of most Chinese women, close quote. As for the dubious ethics displayed by Grant's administration, there were at least 10 incidents of misconduct during his 8-year presidency. The sheer number and frequency that repeatedly signified Grant's association with men of questionable character may also hint at his own potential personal culpability. Consider, for example, the president's conduct during the whiskey ring scandal, which involved tax evasion, and bribery in the distilled spirits industry, which was the top source of domestic federal tax revenue. Tariffs were actually a bigger source of revenue, but they were not considered domestic federal tax revenue. They were considered external tax revenue as opposed to internal tax revenue. And the difference between those two terms is what led to the creation of the name Internal Revenue Service, because they were looking at internal taxes. But that's years down the road. That didn't happen until long after Grant had left the presidency. So let me continue. Ultimately, we're back to the whiskey ring scandal. Ultimately, the Treasury's investigation led to the threshold of the presidency when Grant's personal secretary, Orville Babcock, was indicted as a leading ring conspirator. Grant responded by trying to move the trial to a friendly military court, since Babcock was also an Army officer. But a Justice Department prosecutor blocked that move by noting the procedural violations that would result from removing evidence from the court of jurisdiction. Second, Grant hired a spy to infiltrate the prosecutor's office, but the spy eventually sided with the prosecution against Grant's private secretary. Third, Grant fired an assistant prosecutor whose comments during a jury summation personally offended the president. Fourth, he forbade prosecutors to plea bargain with low-level conspirators as a means to convict high-level participants. That's a common practice today. Get the lower guys to squeal and the bigger guys so you can get the bigger guys. Grant prohibited that in this investigation. Fifth, 2 days before Babcock's trial, the Treasury Department's chief clerk wrote a future Supreme Court justice, quote, "What has hurt Treasury Secretary Bristow worst of all and most disheartened him is the final conviction that Grant himself is in the ring," meaning the conspiracy ring, "and knows all about it," close quote. Grant also used a law commonly associated with protecting Black civil rights in the South to police voter registrations in big northern cities where growing immigrant populations were steadily strengthening the Democrat Party. When the wife of Attorney General George Williams accused Grant of using Secret Service funds to benefit Republican candidates in New York City, the president explained that the money was spent in compliance with the 1871 Ku Klux Klan Acts to pay for voter registrations. The Ku Klux Klan Acts are commonly believed by most modern observers to apply to the South, but in truth, Grant used most of the money for it in the northern cities where the Democrat Party was growing stronger because of the increasing immigrants. I'll continue reading now. Grant was also an eager recipient of valuable gifts for which he would reciprocate with patronage appointments. Between 1865 and 1869 inclusive, this is before he became president, donors bought or gave him enough money to buy a total of 4 homes, one in Galena, Illinois, one in Philadelphia, one in Washington, and one in Long Branch, New Jersey. One of the 7 donors to the 27-room Long Branch, quote, cottage, close quote, was Tom Murphy, who was a notorious supplier of shoddy merchandise to the Union Army during the Civil War. Grant appointed Murphy as customs collector for the port of New York, where anywhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of America's tariffs were collected. It was the most lucrative patronage assignment available in the federal government. Similarly, Grant assigned General Daniel Butterfield to New York's sub-treasury office in exchange for Butterfield's raising a fund enabling General William T. Sherman to buy Grant's Washington home at a price that was more than double the price Grant paid for the home only 3 years earlier. Soon after his appointment, Butterfield took a bribe to join Jay Gould's attempted corner of the gold market in September 1869. That September 1869 gold scandal was early in Grant's presidential administration. Historians specializing in the Civil War and Reconstruction era may sometimes be more persuaded by Grant's words than his actions. But as J.P. Morgan once remarked, quote, "A man always has two reasons for the things he does, a good one and a real one," close quote. Morgan was implying that the good reason is a false benevolent explanation that conceals the real self-serving one. For example, Grant justified restricting the immigration of Chinese women by implying that he wanted to avoid forcing them into prostitution. In his 1875 annual message, he said, and this is annual message as president, quote, "Few of the women are brought to our shores to pursue honorable or useful occupations," close quote. But Chinese American history specialist Jean Palzer concludes that the true purpose of the act was, quote, "to force thousands of men to return to China," close quote, since only 4% of Asian Americans in 1875 were women. Similarly, Grant initially signaled a benevolent attitude towards Indians. In his first annual message in December 1869, he announced that he had put Quakers in charge of several reservations because the sect had long coexisted peaceably with Indians. Quote, "From the foundation of the government to the present, management of the Indians has been a subject of embarrassment and attended with continuous robberies, murders, and wars. I do not hold the conduct of the whites blameless and have attempted a new Quaker-managed policy with fair results so far, which I hope will be a great success," close quote. Yet his professions of good feelings proved false when he launched the Centennial War noted above in 1876 that resulted in Custer's last stand, and for which the Supreme Court ruled in the 20th century was illegal, thereby awarding $100 million in damages to the tribe descendants. After winning re-election in 1872, Grant greeted a group of African Americans that came to congratulate him on his victory. The president told them that what they wanted to hear, quote, "I wish that every man in the United States could stand in all respects alike," close quote. But to Grant, every man did not include Indians and Chinese Americans, among other non-Black minorities. Grant sometimes contradicted himself. His true meaning, therefore, must be inferred from his actions, not his words. Yet, some modern biographers too readily accept the statements that reflect upon him favorably and ignore the contradictory ones. Charles Calhoun does so when suggesting that Grant supported labor over capital in the 1877 railroad strike during the first year of Rutherford Hayes' presidency. Hayes was the president after Grant. He was also Republican. So while complaining that the press had been overly critical of his use, Grant's use of federal troops in the South, Grant complained, quote, now, during the 1877 railroad strike, however, there is no hesitation about exhausting the whole power of the government to suppress a strike on the slightest intimation that danger threatens. But in an August 27, 1877 letter to brother-in-law Abel Corbin, Grant displayed a hard stance towards labor. He wrote regarding that same strike, quote, my judgment is that the strike should have been put down with a strong hand and so summarily as to prevent a like occurrence for a generation, close quote. Finally, even though Grant's fundamental interest in black civil rights may have reflected the power of the group's voting bloc more than the morality of racial equality, it ultimately failed to be enough to sustain his support. The moment of truth came during the autumn 1875 elections in Mississippi and Ohio. Mississippi carpetbag Governor Albert Ames twice asked Grant for federal troops to police the polls on election day in order to ensure that all the blacks could vote. But Grant turned him down. It would be another 40 years before Republican Mississippi Congressman and black John Lynch revealed that Grant confessed to him in November 1875 that Ohio politicians told the president that federal intervention in Mississippi would likely cause Republicans to lose the vote in Ohio. Basically, Grant traded a Republican victory in Mississippi for a bigger one in Ohio. In other words, he tolerated a Republican defeat in Mississippi where most of the Republicans were black in order to get a bigger one in Ohio. And thereafter, the autumn elections of 1875, the Republican Party steadily lost interest in Southern blacks. Understanding Grant's roller coaster reputation begins with the study of contrast. In a mere 7 years, he rose from obscurity to the presidency, only to generally skid downward from his inauguration day to the end of his second term. So the next chapter begins with a little bit of background on Grant. But anyway, that's the preface, and that's as far as I wanted to go with this episode. I hope you found it interesting. Again, you can get a personally signed copy of Grant's Failed Presidency from me by emailing me Phil_Leigh, L-E-I-G-H, at me.com. And for $23, you get a signed copy, and I pay postage here in the United States. If you want a copy just from Amazon, just go to Amazon. The cost there is $20. Okay, so this again is Monday, the 26th of October, and that's our show for today. Thanks for watching.